It is only by hearsay, by word of mouth passed down from generation to generation, that whole peoples adore the God of their fathers and of their priests. Authority, confidence, submission and custom with them take the place of conviction or of proofs. They prostrate themselves and pray, because their fathers taught them to prostrate themselves and pray. But why did their fathers fall to their knees? In primitive times, their legislators and guides made it their duty. Adore and believe, they said, the gods whom you cannot understand. Have confidence in our profound wisdom. We know more than you about divinity. If ignorance of nature gave birth to gods, knowledge of nature is made for their destruction. Percy Bysshe Shelley was born on the 4th of August 1792 in Horsham, England. His father, Sir Timothy Shelley, was a Whig politician, and his mother, Elizabeth Pilfold, was the daughter of an affluent family. As the eldest son, Shelley stood to inherit a considerable estate and seat in Parliament, but it wasn't to be. In sticking true to his principles, he sacrificed his security. By the age of 6, little Percy's intellect was apparent, with him displaying an impressive memory and fluidity in multiple languages. Throughout his school years, however, he was severely bullied, being belittled as Mad Shelley and Shelley the Atheist, and as a likely consequence he suffered hallucinations and nightmares throughout the rest of his life. Young Shelley had a deep fascination for all tales of mystery, romance and the supernatural, as well as a love for science, or, more accurately, terrifying his bullies with gunpowder. Yes, I'm serious, gunpowder. He once blew up a school fence. He published his first novel at 17, titled Zastrozzi, in which he expressed some of his heretical and atheistic views through his antagonist, and thereby avoided them being ascribed to him personally. A year later, he again expressed his atheistic views, this time anonymously through an essay titled The Necessity of Atheism, which he sent to all the bishops and heads of Oxford University. The university's extreme response had profound consequences on Shelley's life, and we'll detail them and the essay's importance in just a moment. For someone whose genius wasn't appreciated until after his death, we actually know a great deal about Shelley's short life, courtesy in large part of his widow Mary Shelley, the author of the novel Frankenstein. Yeah, you might have heard of it.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! Oh, in the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
Should you be interested, I've left links in the description to a full account of Shelley's life, but in short, he was unfortunately beset by ill health, family crisis, financial distress, and discrimination against his atheistic and political views, culminating in his exile to Italy in 1818. Two of the women who loved him committed suicide, one of which being his first wife, Harriet, and after a long-fought battle for custody of their 2 children, he was deemed unfit and denied, with the prosecution citing his atheistic writings as proof of his immorality. Worse still, of his 6 children, only 1 survived adulthood, and Shelley himself drowned at the age of just 29, when he and 2 others found their poorly crafted ship enveloped by a violent storm. 10 days later, Shelley's badly decomposed body washed ashore, only being identified by his clothing and a poem in his jacket pocket written by John Keats. But despite being cremated on the beach, his story didn't end there. The poet Leigh Hunt plucked Shelley's scorched heart from the embers, which had resisted burning due to calcification from an earlier tuberculosis infection. But many moons later, he finally handed the heart to Mary, who saw it buried.
For centuries, people had sought meaning in their lives by believing in God, in heaven and in hell. But one young romantic claimed that atheism was the necessary foundation of a free and enlightened life. He was the author of this anonymous pamphlet, a brilliant young Oxford student who claimed that without proof of the existence of God, it made no sense to believe in him.
God is a hypothesis, and as such stands in need of proof. The Onus Probandi rests on the theist. Nailing the burden of proof is but one of many brilliant insights to be found in Shelley's essay, which has inspired many a freethinker, including myself. In fact, I've genuinely had a very difficult time selecting which parts to share here, as I could happily recite every single word. The fact that Shelley wrote this when he was 19 blows my mind. Truly, this kid was a prodigy of reason. The essay begins by refuting Doxastic Voluntarism, the view that people choose their beliefs. Shelley writes, "When a proposition is offered to the mind, it perceives the agreement or disagreement of the ideas of which it is composed. A perception of the agreement is termed belief. The investigation being confused for the perception has induced many falsely to imagine that the mind is active in belief, that belief is an act of volition, in consequence of which it may be regulated by the mind. Continuing this mistake, they have attached a degree of criminality to disbelief, of which, in its nature, it is incapable." Think about it. Do you choose to believe or disbelieve that Muhammad split the moon, or that Thor defeated the frost giants? You can choose whether or not you'll expose yourself to the alleged evidence. That is, you can choose whether or not you'll investigate the claim, but you don't get to choose whether or not you're convinced by the alleged evidence. This is largely accepted in our time, but it wasn't in Shelley's, and more crucially, it still isn't accepted by most religions. For instance, Jesus said unto him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father, but by me." Hence, if you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to hell. You're going to be infinitely punished for the finite crime of not being convinced by insufficient evidence. So much for a loving God, huh? A second theological assertion that Shelley addresses in The Necessity is the ever-present God of the gaps. Here's just a taster. The pride of philosophy is unwilling to admit its ignorance of their causes. The being called God by no means answers to the conditions prescribed by Newton. It bears every mark of a veil woven by philosophical conceit to hide the ignorance of philosophers even from themselves. Every time we say that God is the author of some phenomenon, that signifies that we are ignorant of how such a phenomenon was able to operate by the aid of forces or causes that we know in nature. Ignorance was ubiquitous during the early 17th century, as whilst Shelley experienced and in part inspired the Age of Enlightenment, the people of his time knew nothing of the germ theory of disease, Big Bang cosmology, or, and I would argue most importantly, evolution by natural selection. Indeed, little Chucky D was just 2 years old when Shelley was expelled from Oxford.
What would you be like if you were pre-Darwin?
I would probably believe in God if I were pre-Darwin.
Talking of Darwin, let's now pivot to Shelley's essay titled A Refutation of Deism, in which he exposed the folly of the Watchmaker analogy long before the discovery of natural selection. For reminders, the Watchmaker analogy insists that since the complexity of a watch proves a watchmaker, the complexity of life proves a life-maker. Here's but a segment of Shelley's response. Why do we admit design in any machine of human contrivance? Simply because innumerable instances of machines having been contrived by human art are present to our mind. We attribute these effects to human intelligence because we know beforehand that human intelligence is capable of producing them. Take away this knowledge and the grounds of our reasoning will be destroyed. Our entire ignorance, therefore, of the divine nature leaves this analogy defective in its most essential point of comparison. Indeed, it's not the complexity of the watch that suggests a watchmaker, it's the countless examples of watches being created by watchmakers that suggests a watchmaker. Now, the knowledge of natural selection, which came 45 years after Shelley's essay, renders the watchmaker analogy impotent, which is why it's no longer the theist's favourite toy. But before Darwin, most were convinced by the analogy. Shelley, however, wasn't one of them. Where Dawkins assumes he would have been a theist, Shelley was an outspoken, proud atheist. Further still, and this had my jaw on the floor, Shelley was able to figure out that organisms are a product of their environment. He writes, that certain animals exist in certain climates results from the consanguinity of their frames of the circumstance of their situation. Let these circumstances be altered to a sufficient degree, and the elements of their composition must exist in some new combination, no less resulting than the former from those inevitable laws by which the universe is governed. It is the necessary consequence of the organisation of man that his stomach should digest his food. Yeah, despite Shelley having no idea of natural selection, he postulated that organisms are mere reflections of their environment. That is, to me at least, very, very impressive. Likewise to the necessity of atheism, a refutation of deism is saturated with formidable discernments that I could happily unpack for hours, but the few I've selected so far are more than sufficient to demonstrate Shelley's brilliance. This wonderful ape sacrificed a very comfortable life to pave the way for future freethinkers, skeptics, and atheists, and if that doesn't earn your respect, I don't know what will. In preparation for this episode, I've got to know Shelley's words intimately, and I have to say, I don't think I've ever been more impressed. Shelley was remarkably sharp, insightful, and exquisitely eloquent. He had the scarce union of a poet's heart and a scientist's mind, and the result of which is simply the best of humanity. Don't get me wrong, the man was by no means perfect. On more than one occasion he pursued his own pleasures at the expense of others, but some of his writing is as close to perfect as I think is possible. To think of what Shelley would have accomplished if Poseidon had let him be. How ferociously he would have scolded God the All-Loving upon the discovery of the germ theory of disease, or how he would have conveyed the great emancipation of evolution by natural selection. The world will never know. I'm going to leave you with one of my favourite quotes from the Necessity of Atheism, but before doing so, I'd just like to sign off by saying I'm Stephen Woodford, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have supported the channel via other means. Oh, and if you have any suggestions for who I should cover next, please do let me know in the comment section below. If God wishes to be known, cherished, thanked, why does he not show himself under his favourable features to all these intelligent beings by whom he wishes to be loved and adored? Why not manifest himself to the whole world in an unequivocal manner, much more capable of convincing us than these private revelations, which seem to accuse the divinity of an annoying partiality for some of his creatures? The all-powerful, should he not heave more convincing means by which to show man than these ridiculous metamorphoses, these pretended incarnations, which are attested by writers so little in agreement among themselves? In place of so many miracles invented to prove the divine mission of so many legislators revered by the different people of the world, the sovereign of these spirits, could he not convince the human mind in an instant of the things he wished to make known to it? Instead of hanging the sun in the vault of the firmament, instead of scattering the stars without order, and the constellations which fill space, would it not have been in more conformity with the views of a God so jealous of his glory, and so well intentioned for mankind, to write, in a manner not subject to dispute, his name, his attributes, his permanent wishes in ineffaceable characters, equally understood to all the inhabitants of the earth? No one would then be able to doubt the existence of God, of his clear will, of his visible intentions. Under the eyes of this so terrible God, no one would have the audacity to violate his commands. No mortal would dare risk attracting his anger. Finally, no man would have the effrontery to impose on his name or to interpret his will according to his own fantasy.